Picture this: a crowded medieval street, the clatter of horse hooves, the smoke of burning wood drifting through the air, merchants shouting, children laughing. Europe in the 1340s was alive, restless, full of noise. And then, silence. Within months, those same streets would be lined with corpses, the laughter replaced by the tolling of church bells, the smell of bread and ale replaced by the stench of decay. This was the Black Death, the deadliest plague in human history. But hidden beneath the tragedy of mass death lies something even darker, a pattern in survival itself, a pattern that divided men and women in ways we are still trying to understand.
In 1347, Europe was fragile. Wars had drained kingdoms, famine had weakened bodies, and medicine was little more than superstition. People believed disease came from bad air, punishment from God, or alignment of the stars. Nobody could imagine that death itself was riding on the backs of fleas carried by rats, slipping silently into ports and towns. The ships came from the east. Genoese merchants docking in Sicily brought more than silk and spices. They brought death. Witnesses described sailors covered in black boils, coughing blood, collapsing before they could even unload their cargo. The infection leapt from ship to shore, and within weeks, entire villages were gone. Not weakened, not struggling, gone.
Imagine living in a small town of 1,000 people. You know your neighbors, your family, your priest. Now picture this. Within 6 months, only 200 are left. The others, buried in shallow pits or left unburied because there were no hands left to dig graves. Dogs roamed freely, feeding on corpses. Fires burned constantly, not to cook food, but to mask the smell of death. Survivors spoke of streets where grass grew between cobblestones because no one was left to walk them. And through all this, one fact began to stand out in the records left behind. More men were dying than women.
At first, no one noticed. Death felt random, unstoppable. But as weeks turned into years, patterns emerged. Widows became far more common than widowers. Chronicles written by monks, city records, even tax ledgers, all pointed to the same strange reality. Men were dying faster, women surviving longer. Why? Was it biology? Was it luck? Or something deeper? Modern science gives us a few clues. Women's immune systems often react more aggressively to infections. They have 2 X chromosomes, which carry immune-related genes, while men only have 1. Estrogen provides additional protection against certain pathogens. Testosterone, on the other hand, can weaken immune defenses. In other words, when the plague came, men's bodies were more vulnerable. But biology isn't the whole story. Men were out in the fields, in markets, in the thick of war and trade. They were exposed to strangers, animals, and risk. Women, often confined to the home, were slightly shielded. But confinement didn't mean safety. Many women became caregivers, washing the sick, feeding the dying, and somehow, some of them still survived. Chroniclers were baffled. How could the ones closest to the infected still walk away alive when strong men dropped dead in days? In Paris, a friar named Jean Divinet wrote of what he saw.
In many towns, scarcely 1 in 10 survived. And yet, women endured more than men. Husbands were taken, wives remained. Children cried for fathers who would never return. These were not scientific studies. They were desperate observations. But across Europe, the pattern repeated. The plague was rewriting not only populations, but the balance of survival between the sexes. Think about what this did to the human mind. A husband watching his wife outlive him. A mother seeing her sons fall while her daughters endured. The plague tore apart families, but it also reshaped how people thought about strength and weakness. Strength was no longer the soldier, the laborer, the knight. Sometimes strength looked like the midwife, the widow, the mother who somehow endured.
The Black Death wasn't just a disease. It was an experiment in human survival, brutal, unforgiving, and deeply revealing. And when the smoke cleared and the bells stopped tolling, one truth was carved into the memory of Europe. Survival was not equal. It was divided. And in that divide between men and women lies a terrifying pattern that would repeat itself again and again through history. When bodies pile up faster than they can be buried, the living don't just fear death, they begin to fear life itself. The Black Death was not only the greatest biological disaster in human history, it was also a psychological earthquake. It shattered the way people thought about God, family, love, and even gender itself. And as the plague deepened, the gap between male and female survival rates created not just loss, but paranoia, suspicion, and haunting questions about why one sex seemed to endure while the other fell. Before the plague, religion explained everything. If crops failed, it was God's anger. If armies won battles, it was God's blessing. But when the plague came, killing priests, monks, bishops, and entire monasteries, people's faith cracked.
They imagined this. A village priest blesses his sick flock, lays his hands on the dying, prays over them, and then he dies within days. If even holy men perished, was anyone truly protected? And yet women seemed to be surviving in larger numbers. In the eyes of terrified men, this survival began to take on a mystical, even sinister meaning. Were women closer to God or closer to the devil? The plague didn't just kill bodies, it sowed distrust between the sexes. When wives outlived husbands, suspicion grew. Some whispered that women were witches, immune because they had made a pact with evil. Others claimed women survived because they were weaker, less exposed, less important in society. Both explanations reflected fear, not science.
But the numbers were undeniable. Chroniclers recorded widow after widow, while male lines of inheritance simply vanished. For the first time in centuries, women were surviving crises in ways men were not. In Florence, the famous writer Giovanni Boccaccio described the horror in detail. He wrote of families abandoning each other, parents deserting children, and husbands leaving wives to die alone. But woven into his stories is a detail often overlooked. When families collapsed, it was often women who endured longer, carrying the memory of what had been lost. Imagine a Florentine widow, surrounded by silence in her home. Her husband gone, her sons gone, only she remains. To her, survival felt like punishment. And yet, it was a survival rooted in biology, in chance, not blessing, not curse. But in the minds of her neighbors, it became something more. Proof that women were tied to life and death in mysterious ways men could never fully control.
Love itself transformed under the plague. Courtship, marriage, even intimacy became haunted by the awareness of death. Why pledge yourself to someone when tomorrow they might be gone? Why invest in romance when survival was uncertain? Men, facing higher mortality, clung desperately to the idea of leaving heirs. Women, who survived in greater numbers, found themselves both desired and resented. Desired because they represented continuity, life after death. Resented because their very survival reminded men of their own fragility. This was the terrifying paradox. Women became symbols of endurance, while men became symbols of loss.
The answer, of course, was far simpler. Women's immune systems, their hormonal balances, their chromosomes gave them an edge. But in the 14th century, this difference bred suspicion. The plague was reshaping not just who lived and who died, but how men and women saw each other.
In some regions, women who survived too visibly were accused of witchcraft. Survival became dangerous. To endure when others fell made you suspicious. And so the plague did not just divide men and women through biology, it divided them through psychology. Imagine being a woman who lost her entire family, only to be whispered about as a witch. Imagine being a man, watching his brothers fall, wondering why his sisters still lived. This was not just grief. It was a slow poison eating at trust, love, and human connection itself.
The Black Death stripped away illusions. It showed people that strength was fragile, that faith could fail, and that love could be broken by fear. But most terrifying of all, it revealed a pattern hidden deep in human survival. Men and women do not endure crises equally. And as Europe crawled out of the ashes of plague, that imbalance would reshape society, inheritance, and the psychology of gender for generations to come.
The plague was over, but its lessons about survival, about biology, and about love were only just beginning. As the plague's shadow began to recede from Europe, the survivors emerged into a world permanently scarred. Half the population was gone. Cities that once rang with the sound of markets and churches stood silent. Entire family lineages had vanished in a single season. But beneath the grief and ruin, a deeper truth had taken root, one that would quietly shape gender roles, social contracts, and even our psychology for centuries to come. The plague had not only exposed the fragility of civilization, it had stripped away the illusions of sameness between men and women. It had revealed two survival strategies, parallel, contradictory, yet equally human. Men defaulted to coalition, to the group. They carried bodies, formed burial societies, defended collapsing towns, often sacrificing themselves in the process. Women, on the other hand, contracted inward. They focused fiercely on their bloodline, their children, or, in the absence of kin, on their own preservation. These weren't conscious choices. They were the echoes of evolutionary pressures, surfacing in a moment when the stage of society itself had been ripped apart.
This divergence was not recorded in philosophical treatises or theological debates. It lived in the dusty city records, in chronicles of abandoned children, in whispered stories of men who starved because they shared too much, and of women who survived by withdrawing all compassion outside their own kin circle. It was a terrifying pattern, because it suggested that our grand moral codes, our laws, even our religions, were not built on natural equality, but on fragile systems designed to manage, balance, and sometimes disguise these ancient instincts. What does this mean for us today? After all, we no longer live in the 14th century. We have medicine, governments, human rights, and an entire culture built around compassion and cooperation. Surely the Black Death was an anomaly, a nightmare from which we have awakened.
But history whispers otherwise. Hiroshima, the Gulag, the famines of China, even the chaos of modern war zones, all echo the same divide. When civilization collapses, men instinctively look outward, building tribes, forming coalitions, fighting or dying for a collective. Women instinctively look inward, conserving resources for their children or themselves, cutting ties to non-kin with ruthless efficiency. These are not moral judgments. They are survival algorithms, brutal, efficient, and as real today as they were in the plague-stricken streets of Florence.
And yet, here is the paradox.
Civilization itself, the laws, the cities, the religions, the art, the peace, was overwhelmingly built by men acting on that coalition instinct. But it was preserved and made meaningful by women acting on the survival of kin. Without one, the other collapses. Without men, no tribe is defended. Without women, no lineage survives. The tension between the two is what forged humanity's strange, often contradictory story. The Black Death didn't invent these instincts. It merely stripped away the masks and forced us to see them in their rawest, most terrifying form. And that is why its lesson is so dangerous, because once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Think about the modern world. Dating apps, social media, even political movements. Don't they reflect the same patterns? Men building communities, movements, ideologies. Women carefully selecting, optimizing, securing the best possible outcome for themselves and their kin. We like to tell ourselves that love, attraction, loyalty, and cooperation are purely cultural. But deep down, in crisis, we return to those ancient programs. The terrifying truth of the Black Death is not just about history. It is a mirror held up to our present. We want to believe in universal human goodness, in equal sacrifice, in the blank slate of human behavior. But history, psychology, and biology tell us otherwise. The contract of civilization is thin, fragile, and male-dependent, and the survival strategies it masks are older than time.
So the next time you hear stories of resilience, of cooperation in disasters, of communities pulling together, remember the shadow side. Remember the chronicles of the plague, where men dug graves for strangers while women clutched only their own children. Remember the testimonies of Hiroshima, where men formed rescue squads while women turned inward, running alone. Remember the Gulag, where male solidarity often ended in death, while female survival often meant ruthless recalibration. This is the black truth of human nature. It is not evil. It is not even cruel. It is simply real. The plague is gone. The bodies turn to dust. But the instincts that surfaced in those dark years live on in us, in you, in me. The Black Death did more than kill millions. It revealed a blueprint, a survival script etched into our DNA. And if history has taught us anything, it's that the next time civilization cracks, the same blueprint will return, the same divide will surface. And once again, humanity will be forced to confront the terrifying difference between how men and women survive. This is the wisdom of the ruins, the story that civilization tries to forget, but which survival never allows us to erase. Because in the end, the Black Death was not just about death, it was about truth, a truth too uncomfortable for most to face. But for those who do, it changes everything.